The first time I realized I was nothing more than a stranger in my own family, it wasn't because of one big incident. It was the little moments. The glances that lasted a little too long, the hushed voices that stopped whenever I walked into the room, the dinners where my chair felt more like an outsider's seat at a crowded table than a place meant for me. My name is Daniel, and I grew up believing blood meant loyalty. But blood, I learned, could also poison you if the veins carrying it were filled with envy, resentment, and greed. It started early. My father was a stern man, always favoring my older brother Adrian. Adrian was the golden boy, the one who could do no wrong. My mother, delicate and wary, always poured her attention into my sister Clara, who was soft-spoken and fragile. And me? I was the quiet one, the middle child who seemed to slip between the cracks. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. I buried myself in books, in quiet walks by the river, in dreams that only I seemed to care about. But over time, the weight of being invisible started to press down on me, crushing little pieces of my heart each day. The cruelty didn't come all at once, it was gradual. A comment here, a laugh there. I remember Adrian once saying at dinner, with that smug smirk of his, "Daniel's good for nothing except hiding in his room." Everyone laughed, even my mother, though she covered her mouth as if embarrassed. I laughed too, pretending it didn't sting, but inside I wanted to scream. As I grew older, the distance only widened. Adrian inherited my father's business, Clara was married off to a wealthy man, and I was expected to figure things out. Whenever there were family gatherings, I was treated like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. I was never asked about my life, my work, or my dreams. They didn't even know where I lived most of the time. I could have disappeared from their lives completely, and I doubt they would have noticed. The final straw came at my father's birthday celebration. I hadn't been invited directly. Clara sent me a half-hearted text saying, "You can come if you want." When I arrived, I saw the way they looked at me, like I had stumbled in uninvited, like I didn't belong. I gave my father a gift, a vintage watch I had saved up for months to buy. He barely glanced at it before setting it aside and turning his attention back to Adrian, who had just announced plans to expand the family business. The room filled with applause, and I stood there, gift still in my hand, invisible as always. Later that night, I overheard them talking. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but as I passed by the study, I heard my name. My father's voice was low, cold. "Daniel's weak. He'll never amount to anything. We should stop wasting time on him." Adrian laughed. "I've been saying that for years. He's practically a stranger here." And Clara, sweet Clara, added softly, "Sometimes I forget he's even part of this family." Those words cut deeper than any blade. I stumbled back, my chest tightening, the air stolen from my lungs. That night I left the house without saying goodbye. I walked through the city streets, each step heavy with betrayal. If they thought I was a stranger, then maybe it was time I became one. What they didn't know, what none of them could even imagine, was that I carried a secret. A truth so powerful it could turn their world upside down. For years, I had hidden it, keeping it buried while I endured their coldness. But as I walked away from that house, rage and sorrow burning in my chest, I realized it was time. Time for them to see me, to finally understand who I truly was. The secret wasn't something small. It wasn't about wealth or success. It was something that tied directly to the very foundation of the family they cherished so much. And the moment I revealed it, their carefully built world would crumble. I remember standing at the edge of the old bridge that night, looking at the water shimmering under the moonlight. My reflection stared back at me, and for the first time, I didn't see weakness. I saw strength. I saw someone who had endured years of cruelty and still stood tall. I clenched my fists and whispered into the night, "They'll regret ever treating me like a stranger. They'll see who I really am." What I didn't know then was just how far the truth would take me, how deeply it would shake them, and how much it would change me too. Because secrets have a way of not just destroying others, but reshaping the very person who holds them. When I woke the next morning, the anger still burned in my chest, but it was no longer wild and directionless. It had hardened into something sharp, something I could control. For the first time in years, I felt clarity. My family had stripped me of every ounce of belonging, of dignity, of worth, yet they had no idea who they were dealing with. They thought I was the quiet one, the weak one. They didn't know about the life I'd built beyond their sight. Years earlier, when Adrian had been groomed to inherit my father's business, I had been dismissed from even the smallest role in the company. "You don't have the drive," my father had said. "Best not to waste your time or ours." I walked out of that office with nothing but shame burning inside me. But instead of collapsing, I disappeared into a different world. I started small, learning everything I could about technology, investments, and global markets. While they laughed at me for being the family's shadow, I worked silently, building connections, taking risks, watching others fail where I learned. By 28, I had founded a company that specialized in cybersecurity and financial intelligence. By 30, I had investments spread across continents, partners in places my family couldn't pronounce, and enough influence to quietly dismantle men far more powerful than my father and brother combined. But I never flaunted it. I lived modestly, drove an ordinary car, rented a quiet apartment. I had learned long ago that visibility attracted envy, and envy invited destruction. So I stayed in the background, watching, waiting, growing stronger while they dismissed me as insignificant. That night, after hearing their cruel words, I decided it was time to stop hiding. Not in a way that would give them the satisfaction of seeing me boast, but in a way that would make them feel the weight of every insult, every moment of disregard. They wanted to treat me like a stranger. Then they would come to fear the stranger living in their midst. The opportunity came faster than I expected. Adrian was reckless. Despite the praise he constantly received, he had a dangerous flaw: pride. He flaunted his success, took unnecessary risks with the business, and trusted all the wrong people. It didn't take much digging through my company's resources to uncover his shady dealings, bribes to government officials, hidden debts, fraudulent reports to keep the board at ease. I stared at the evidence on my screen one night, my jaw clenched. The golden boy wasn't so golden after all, but exposing him right away wasn't enough. No, it had to be slow, precise. I wanted them to feel the cracks forming beneath their feet, the uncertainty, the fear. I wanted them to question everything they thought they knew about their perfect son and heir. I started by buying silent shares in their company under different names, slipping into the structure they thought they controlled. Piece by piece, I gained influence without them noticing. At family dinners, where I sat ignored, I smiled quietly to myself, knowing I owned more of their world than they realized. Clara, on the other hand, was different. She wasn't cruel by nature, but she was weak, easily swayed, desperate for approval. Her marriage to her wealthy husband had been her ticket out of insignificance, and she clung to it with trembling hands. I knew her secret too. Her husband wasn't faithful. My team had intercepted emails, photos, proof of affairs with women half her age. Clara had built her entire sense of worth around that marriage, and the knowledge in my possession was enough to shatter her. It might sound cruel, but I didn't act out of malice for malice's sake. I acted out of justice. For years I had been the family's shadow. Now it was time for them to feel what it was like to be powerless, to be fragile, to realize they had underestimated the one person who could bring their entire world crashing down. One evening, my father called a family meeting at the house. I almost laughed when I got the message, family meeting, as if I had ever been considered part of that word. But I went, dressed in my usual simple clothes, blending into the background. They spoke of Adrian's expansion plans, Clara's social events, and then turned to me with that familiar air of dismissal. "Daniel," my father said, his voice clipped, "I hope you found some kind of job by now. You're not getting any younger." I looked at him, and for the first time in my life I didn't feel small under his gaze. I felt powerful. I smiled and replied simply, "I'm doing well enough." Adrian snorted. "Doing well? That's rich. What, delivering packages? Fixing computers?" They laughed again, the same way they always had. But this time their laughter didn't pierce me. It only fueled me. I knew that soon the laughter would stop, because the secret I carried wasn't just about wealth or influence. It was deeper. It was something about the family itself. Something they had buried long ago, hoping no one would ever uncover it. And I had proof that the very foundation of their pride, their legacy, was built on a lie. I stayed quiet that evening, letting them gloat, letting them treat me like an outsider. But as I left the house, I whispered to myself the same words I had spoken on that bridge. They'll see who I really am. And this time it wasn't just a promise. It was a certainty. The storm truly began a week later. I still remember the scent of rain in the air, the heaviness of the clouds, as if nature itself was holding its breath for what I was about to do. I had spent days meticulously preparing, tying every loose end, ensuring every move was deliberate. Revenge is not about rage. It is about patience, precision, and timing. I started with Adrian. My team had gathered enough evidence to make even the most loyal board member turn against him. Fraudulent invoices, falsified contracts, money quietly funneled into offshore accounts. Things that could ruin not just his reputation but send him straight into a courtroom. But I didn't release everything at once. No, that would have been too merciful. Instead, I arranged for whispers to begin. Anonymous tips to journalists, documents, accidentally leaked to competitors. I watched as Adrian began to sweat, his easy charm cracking when reporters started circling him like vultures. One evening, Clara called me. It was rare for her to reach out, but her voice trembled as she said, "Daniel, have you heard about Adrian? The papers are saying terrible things." I let out a soft sigh, feigning ignorance. Really, that's strange. Adrian's always been perfect. She didn't catch the edge in my tone. She was too rattled. For once, she was looking to me for comfort, the brother she had spent years overlooking. But I gave her nothing, just silence that made her uneasy. Meanwhile, my father was furious. His pride, his empire, was under threat. I could almost see him pacing his grand office, barking at Adrian, demanding explanations. For so long my father had looked at me like I was the family's failure. Now, he was watching his golden son stumble, and though he didn't know it, the stranger he dismissed was the one holding the strings. But Adrian's downfall was just one layer. Clara was next. I hadn't wanted to hurt her, not really. But I couldn't let weakness excuse betrayal. She had laughed at me too. She had stood by as they dismissed me, and for that, she would learn what it meant to lose the thing she valued most. I arranged an anonymous delivery. An envelope slipped into her husband's office. Photos. Screenshots. Emails. The truth, neatly packaged in a way that couldn't be denied. I knew the kind of man her husband was. Arrogant, entitled. He wouldn't bother to explain himself, wouldn't apologize. He'd lash out, blame her, make her feel like she was nothing. And when that happened, she would come face to face with the same emptiness I had carried for years. Sure enough, a few days later, Clara showed up at my apartment. She looked broken, mascara streaked down her cheeks, her hands shaking. "Heh, he's leaving me, Daniel. He says I'm pathetic, that I should have known." Her voice cracked, and she sank into my couch, sobbing. I stood there, watching her. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her it would be okay. But another part of me, the part that had endured years of being invisible, remained cold. "I'm sorry, Clara," I said quietly. "But maybe now you understand what it feels like, to be treated like you don't matter." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with confusion and pain, as if she finally saw me. Not as the quiet brother in the corner, but as someone she had never really known. And still, I wasn't done. The final piece of my revenge was reserved for my father. The man who had built our family name on power and intimidation. The man who had told me, straight to my face, that I was a waste. What he didn't know, what I had uncovered years ago through old documents and silent investigations, was that his empire wasn't built cleanly. There were secrets buried in the foundation, illegal land grabs, partnerships with criminals, a hidden scandal that could erase his legacy in an instant. I had the files, the proof, and I knew exactly how to use them. One night I sat across from him in his study. The same study where I had once overheard them dismiss me as a stranger. He looked older, more fragile than I remembered, his eyes wary from the chaos Adrian's scandal had unleashed. Still, his pride lingered like a stubborn shadow. "What do you want, Daniel?" he asked gruffly, his voice low. "If you're here to gloat about Adrian, don't. This family will survive." I leaned forward, my eyes locking with his. For the first time, I didn't flinch. "I'm not here to gloat. I'm here to tell you something. All those years you called me weak, useless, invisible, I was building. I was watching. And now, Father, I hold your future in my hands." He frowned, confusion flickering in his gaze. "What are you talking about?" I slid a folder across the desk. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. I watched his face pale, his jaw tighten, his eyes widen as he read the documents. Every illegal deal, every buried crime, every secret he thought was long forgotten was staring back at him. Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice cracking. I leaned back, my lips curling into the faintest smile. "From the stranger in your family. The one you never cared to know." In that moment, the room was silent except for the sound of his shallow breathing. The mighty man who had ruled over us with an iron fist looked small, fragile, defeated, and I felt a satisfaction I had never known before. But it wasn't over, not yet, because the true secret, the one that would break them all, hadn't been revealed. The fallout came like a winter storm, fast, brutal, and impossible to ignore. When the documents hit my father's desk, they didn't stay there long. Within hours, subpoenas arrived, phone lines lit up with voices that once trembled before my father's orders, and men who had shaken his hand for decades now avoided his gaze. The empire that had seemed immovable was cracking, and the family that had feasted on its power was suddenly starving for answers. Adrian tried to fight. He sprinted through a maze of denials, press statements, and last-ditch attempts to salvage his image. I watched him on the television, his practiced smile fraying at the edges, his voice hoarse from too many forced rehearsals. Board members who had once toasted his successes now whispered about emergency meetings. Investors skittishly pulled funds. The golden boy, my brother, stood on a platform built of lies and watched it crumble around him. Father called me that night. His voice carried a sort of raw panic I had never heard. Daniel, please. You don't have to do this. Think about the family. The word family sounded small and hollow coming from him, like an echo in an empty room. I could feel the old ache, the years of being dismissed and overlooked. For a moment, something like pity pooled in my chest. I'd never wanted to annihilate him completely. I had wanted recognition, justice, perhaps even an apology. But when I remembered the study, the way he had said I was a waste, the casual cruelty that had been handed down like a birthright, I felt that pity harden into something colder. I'm not trying to destroy the family, I told him. I'm exposing what's been hidden. You made your choices, father. You built a house on rotten timber. I'm simply opening the walls so the truth can breathe. There was a long pause, and then his voice, smaller now, begged, please. There are things you don't understand. We did what we had to do to survive. He sounded younger than his years, like the man who had once been ambitious and terrified, not the Iron Patriarch who had sent me empty-handed from the company office. Survive. It was the word that had driven every decision he'd made, and it was also the justification they'd all used for stepping on anyone in their way. I wondered what it must feel like to look at your children and realize your survival had amounted to their ruin. Adrian lost more than his reputation. He lost his composure. I received a message from an old friend, someone who used to run in the same circles as Adrian, telling me that my brother had been seen drinking in a bar, shouting at strangers about betrayal, slamming his fists against the table as if the world itself owed him recompense. His marriage, already strained, began to show fissures. The man who had once belittled me for being good for nothing now clung to every scrap of validation with a desperation that made me wince. Clara's life collapsed into a different kind of ruin. Her husband left with clinical efficiency, taking photos, jewelry, and rumors like luggage. He filed for a quick, humiliating divorce and sued her for breach of contract in the marriage. An ugly, procedural cruelty that made the neighbors whisper and the charity committees quietly decline invitations. Clara came to me once, eyes raw, asking questions about why the world had become so small and sharp. She accused me in a whisper of orchestrating her humiliation, and I didn't deny it. Did you have to make him leave like that? She asked one night, clutching her knees. Did you have to take everything from me? There was a pain in her voice I couldn't ignore. The kind of pain that wasn't about pride, but about losing the fragile scaffolding that had held her together. For a second, I saw the little girl she had been, the one who had once braided my hair and offered me half her cookie, the one who had later learned to mimic the family's cold politeness to survive. If revenge were only about scoring points, perhaps I would have stopped there. But their cruelty had taught me that hiding within them was a rot that needed excising. One wounded family member was the cost of exposing the disease. The press circled like sharks. Reporters dug through old photographs and public records, connecting the dots I'd planted with invisible ink and careful misdirection. The board convened emergency sessions to distance themselves, while regulators prepared enforcement actions. My father, once a titan, walked like a man in a foreign city, uncertain of each step. He asked to meet me again, this time in the hospital cafeteria, an oddly neutral place that smelled of antiseptic and microwaved food. He sat down across from me, fingers steepled, eyes rimmed red. You could have come to me, he said quietly. We could have made this right, behind closed doors. We are family, Daniel. There it was again, the word family as a shield. I thought of all the times I'd been an afterthought, of the watch I'd given that had been set aside, of the birthday party where my present meant nothing more than a prop. You're right, I said. We are family. Which is why the truth matters. He sobbed then, once, brokenly. And for the first time I saw him as a flawed man instead of a villain. It didn't excuse his actions, but it humanized him. I felt the old mixture of anger and pity swirl inside me, and it made my hands shake. I wanted to reach across the table and take his hand, to tell him that this cruelty had worked both ways. It had hardened me, but it had also shown me the hollow that lived in his chest. As legal pressure mounted, Adrian lashed out at me directly. He accused me in the tabloids of manufacturing the leaks, of betraying the family for some petty grudge. He unfurled the same old insults, the quiet one, the loser, and his words were thrown into the echo chamber of public opinion. It stung, but it didn't break me. I had expected it. People who had base instincts would always lash out first rather than look inward. But amid the chaos, a new twist appeared, an angle I hadn't planned for. A distant relative from the other side of the family tree, one whose name rarely came up at gatherings, surfaced with a curious set of memories about my childhood. He sent a letter to the paper with an anecdote about how, decades ago, a hidden ledger had been moved from one safe to another after a mysterious fire. A ledger that tied my father to a land deal that displaced dozens of families. His letter hinted at a lineage secret, a name different from ours listed in old property records, a note that suggested not everyone in our bloodline was who they claimed to be. The suggestion was subtle, almost casual, but it planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the public, and more dangerously, in the minds of our most loyal allies. If the foundation of our name was shaky, if the roots were tangled with someone else's history, then the arrogance that had protected us began to look fragile. I realized then that the revenge I had crafted, careful, surgical, was beginning to ripple in ways I hadn't anticipated. Families are not just collections of individuals, they are stories passed down, edited, and retold. Expose the edits and you may expose long, buried truths that no one wanted unearthed. I had opened a door to truth, but the corridor beyond was darker and more complicated than I'd imagined. That night, as I sat alone and listened to the distant city hum, I understood the cost of revelation. Justice had a price, and sometimes it demanded sacrifices that cut deeper than one's enemies. I had expected them to fall. I had not expected to feel the ground shift beneath my own feet. The ground beneath me began to tremble, not from guilt, but from the weight of revelations I hadn't anticipated. When that distant relative's letter reached the papers, it ignited a firestorm. Reporters who had once focused solely on Adrian's scandals and father's corruption now dug deeper, tracing our lineage, peeling back the layers of our family tree like detectives searching for buried treasure. And what they found sent shockwaves not only through our household, but through the entire city. It turned out the name we carried with such arrogance wasn't as pure as my father always claimed. Our bloodline had been rewritten, disguised. Decades ago, in a desperate attempt to escape poverty and ruin, my grandfather had assumed the identity of another man, a wealthy landowner who had died under mysterious circumstances. The family name, the empire, the legacy, it had all been built on fraud, theft, and a lie. My father had known. He had buried it, locked it away in ledgers and forgotten safes, and sworn never to let it resurface. Now it had resurfaced. When the news broke, I watched the television in silence. Headlines screamed across the screen: the family of lies, empire built on stolen name, legacy in ruins. My father's face appeared on every channel, no longer the titan of industry but the patriarch of a dynasty tainted by deceit. I thought I would feel triumphant, vindicated. Instead, there was a hollowness inside me, as though I had opened a wound so deep that even I wasn't immune to its sting. Because though they had treated me like a stranger, though they had broken me countless times, this name had been mine too, and watching it burn meant watching a part of myself reduced to ash. Father confronted me again, this time not with anger, but with something far worse: desperation. He came to my apartment unannounced, his once impeccable suit wrinkled. His shoulders slumped as though the weight of the world had finally pressed him into the ground. "Daniel," he rasped, standing in my doorway like a ghost. "You don't understand what you've done. That name, it was all we had. Without it, we are nothing." I looked at him, at the man who had spent his life crushing me under the weight of that very name. "Nothing," I echoed. "You treated me as nothing even when we had everything. Maybe it's time you learned what that word really means." He flinched as though the truth was a blade. For the first time I saw fear in his eyes. Not the fear of losing wealth, but the fear of irrelevance. For men like him, irrelevance was worse than death. Adrian, meanwhile, spiraled into chaos. With the press circling, his scandals exposed, and the family name tarnished, he had no shield left. He called me one night, his voice ragged with rage and alcohol. "This is your fault," he screamed into the phone.
"You've destroyed us!"
"You think anyone cares about you now? You're still nothing, Daniel." "Nothing?" I didn't hang up. I listened to his fury, his desperation, the cracks in the golden boy's facade. When he finally broke down, sobbing, begging me to fix this, I simply whispered, "Now you know what it feels like to be invisible." Then I ended the call. Clara was the quietest of all. She didn't yell, didn't blame me outright. Instead, she withdrew into herself, a hollow figure who wandered between grief and disbelief. When she visited me again, she didn't wear makeup, her once polished exterior crumbling. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her voice no louder than a whisper. "Why, Daniel?" she asked, her eyes glistening. "Why couldn't you just let it go? We could have been happy." I shook my head slowly. "We were never happy, Clara. Not once. You just pretended, and I was tired of pretending." Her lips quivered as though she wanted to argue, but no words came. She left soon after, the sound of the door closing behind her heavier than any argument. Despite the wreckage, I knew my revenge wasn't complete. Not yet. The truth had shattered their pride, their wealth, their illusions. But I still hadn't revealed the final piece, the secret I had kept locked in my heart longer than anything else. It was the truth not just about the family's name, but about me. I had discovered it years ago. buried in the same ledgers and papers that detailed my grandfather's fraud. It was a secret so devastating that if revealed, it would forever change the way they saw me. Not just as a stranger, but as something entirely different. Because the truth was, I wasn't fully one of them at all. My mother, gentle, fragile, overlooked, had carried her own secret. I wasn't my father's son. The man they had despised, ignored, belittled for being different had never truly been theirs to begin with. And the irony. The blood they had mocked me for, the weakness they thought they saw in me. It was the very blood that had given me the strength to outgrow them. As I sat there in the quiet of my apartment, the weight of that truth pressing against my chest, I realized that the final act of my revenge wasn't about tearing them down. It was about revealing exactly why I had never belonged, and making them understand that the stranger they had cast aside had never truly been part of their family at all. The night I chose to reveal the final truth, the city seemed unnaturally still. It was as if the world knew that something irreversible was about to unfold. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my plain jacket, the same kind they had mocked me for wearing at family gatherings. I didn't dress for power, not tonight. I wanted to face them as myself, not the shadow they had dismissed, not the empire I had secretly built, but the man they had never truly known. I called them together in the old house, the place where it had all begun. The dining room smelled faintly of polish and dust, its long table stretching between us like a battlefield. Father sat at the head, though his shoulders sagged and his eyes were hollow. Adrian slouched nearby, his anger simmering just below the surface. Clara looked tired, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped a glass of water. They watched me as I remained standing, the outsider now commanding the room. For a moment, I thought of the countless dinners where I had been invisible, and I felt a strange calm. "You've asked me why I've done this," I began, my voice steady. "Why I've exposed the lies, the scandals, the fraud. You think it was just revenge, but there's more you don't know, something I've carried alone for years." The father narrowed his eyes, his voice brittle. "What more could you possibly say, Daniel? Haven't you ruined us enough?" I reached into my bag and placed a single folder on the table. Inside were the documents I had kept hidden, the letters, the DNA results, the evidence that had haunted me. My hand lingered on the folder as I looked at them one by one. "All my life you treated me like a stranger," I said. "You laughed at me, ignored me, made me feel like I didn't belong. And you were right, I don't belong, because I'm not truly one of you." The silence that followed was suffocating. Adrian scoffed, trying to laugh it off. "What nonsense is this?" I opened the folder and slid the papers toward Father. "Mother had a secret. I'm not your son, I never was. My blood comes from someone else. Someone you never knew, someone who wasn't poisoned by greed or arrogance. That's why I never fit into your perfect little family. That's why I was different." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Adrian's laughter died in his throat, replaced by shock. Father's face, however, was unreadable. He stared at the papers, his jaw locked, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. "It's not true," he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. "She would never." But I saw it in his eyes. He knew. He had always suspected, perhaps. Maybe it explained why he had always looked at me with a certain disdain, a doubt he couldn't voice. Now, the truth was undeniable. "You see," I continued, my tone softer now, "you were right to call me a stranger, because I was never really yours. And yet, despite not being yours, I built more than you ever imagined. While you clung to a stolen name, I forged something real. Something that can't be taken away by scandal or lies. That's the difference between us." Clara began to cry quietly, her tears slipping onto the table. Adrian muttered curses under his breath, shaking his head as if denial could undo the truth. Father sat frozen, his pride finally shattered beyond repair. For years he had built an empire on a lie. For years he had clung to a family name that wasn't truly his. And now, the son he had rejected had revealed the greatest humiliation of all. That the bloodline he worshipped so much had already been broken long ago. I stepped back, letting the weight of my words sink in. "I came here tonight not to destroy you further, but to give you the truth you always denied me. You called me a stranger. And now, I accept it. I don't need your name. I don't need your approval. I never did." With that, I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard Clara's sobs, Adrian's curses, and my father's silence. The silence of a man who had finally lost everything. When I stepped outside, the air was cool, fresh, almost cleansing. For the first time in my life, I felt light. I wasn't the shadow anymore, nor the invisible sun clawing for recognition. I was free. They had treated me like a stranger. And in the end, they were right. But what they never understood was that being a stranger had given me strength. Strength to survive, to build, to rise. And as their world crumbled behind me, I walked into mine, a world I had created with my own hands, untainted by their poison. And that was the sweetest revenge of all.